Hi, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us today for the first time from Washington, D.C., Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, who is the author of the Axios China newsletter and a China reporter for Axios. Wonderful to have you, Bethany. Also joining us from Washington, Elise Labott, formerly of CNN and now a columnist with Foreign Policy. Elise, great to see you back again.
Good to be here.
And this time all the way from San Francisco, Bobby Ghosh, who is the opinion writer for Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, great to have you back as well. A lot of things to talk about. There's still a big fallout from Biden's trip a week ago now already to Europe for the G7 and a whole variety of summits. And we want to talk a little bit today about how other countries are reacting to this. Starting with you, Bethany, China was not anywhere at the summit, but what was everywhere at these summits. It was sort of the underlying rationale for Biden's trip to Europe, both at the G7, even at NATO, and to some extent, even meeting with Putin. So question, how did Beijing look at the trip? What did it see coming out of it? And what do you think it's going to do about it?
Well, I think what Beijing saw coming out of the trip was kind of its worst nightmare. China's big hope with the presidential, transition from the Trump administration, which was super anti-China and also very destructive of its own alliances. So China's big hope was that Biden would be much softer on China, that there would be a reset. But what we've seen from the Biden administration and, all the way from their campaign was also still tough rhetoric on China and the promise to renew U.S. alliances and to bring that diplomatic heft to the fight with China, to the challenge to China's rise. And I think what Beijing was hoping was that the EU was too damaged, the relationship with the US was too damaged, that it couldn't be recovered, or at least that it couldn't be recovered in such a short period of time. And the EU has been, European countries, particularly Germany and France, have been really, really reluctant to either acknowledge, or at least to publicly acknowledge or to act on what much of the rest of the world, I think, is seeing now as a growing authoritarianism, an assertive and aggressive authoritarianism from Beijing. But what we saw from both the a joint statement from NATO allies, from the G7, and from the US-EU summit were really strong joint statements with the US that condemned China's human rights violations and perhaps genocide in Xinjiang, condemned its actions in Hong Kong. NATO NATO mentioned China's growing aggression and the concerns that poses to transatlantic security and European security. So you really had this, these three joint statements that absolutely accomplished what the Biden administration was hoping to achieve, that is bringing its European transatlantic allies to this fight. And the Chinese mission to the EU denounced the NATO statement, denounced those statements. Other Chinese officials have pushed China publicly, pushed the EU publicly to pursue strategic autonomy. They would love to see EU policy, wedged away from US policy. So this is not what they were hoping for.
So, Bobby, when you look at this from the outside, trying to look at this way, clearly there was an alignment between Europeans and Americans that was different from what we had seen in the Trump administration. But at the same time, there were differences between Americans and Europeans, in particular, on how to deal with China, and sort of the rhetoric coming out of it may, from Beijing's perspective, look not as well as it should be. But how worried should Beijing be that there is now this alignment between the European allies and the United States on China, or are there fissures that they can play with?
Well, I think Bethany is quite right. Beijing put a lot of work between the election last year and these summits into trying to create those fissures and widen them where they existed. And there was some hope, I think, certainly there were, in Beijing, and certainly there was some alarm in Europe that the Germans, for instance, would take a different stance Angela Merkel has been pursuing an economic deal with China, and there was a sense that she would, and maybe other European countries, would want to soften the language that Biden was pushing for. And there was some softening, but certainly nothing to the extent that China would have hoped and expected. I think we can now expect China to work very hard at trying to sort of dive into those fissures, if that's the right analogy, and create, exploit differences. And there are differences. I think the smaller European countries have less at stake economically than the bigger ones, certainly less at stake than the United States, maybe more amenable to economic relations, while at the same time being wary about being caught in what people now call a China debt trap. We've seen that happen in places, particularly in Africa. So it's a mixed bag, but to the point that of your question, Europe is not entirely in lockstep behind the US. There are opportunities, I think, for China to try and peel away one or two of the European countries. But Biden forestalled some of this, and he has raised the bar. The Chinese are now going to have to work a lot harder. And for any European country that feels like it wants to pull away from the group, will now have to fight against what appears to be a strong consensus.
Yeah, at least Tony Blinken came to Europe in his first trip and said, "We're not going to make you choose between us and the Chinese." And yet, kind of, that was the purpose of the trip, not to choose between two, but to basically align with the United States, which meant choosing. How likely do you think this is going to last? Merkel clearly was one of the more reluctant ones, but so were the French and a bunch of others. And it's easy to agree with words. Where's the action? Where's the beef, as they used to say, when it comes to actual action on this? How do you look at it?
I think you're exactly right. And I mean, look, as a candidate, Biden really wanted to emphasize repairing the transatlantic ties and working on a shared approach with China. But don't forget, just before his inauguration, Merkel, when she was president, Germany was president of the EU, pushed for completion of that new investment agreement with China. Other countries want to remain neutral with China. And so you do see that a lot of countries, they do see China's growing rise. They say it's inevitable. We want to do business with them. We want to have good relations with them. At the same time, they also want to support the new US president after 4 years of Trump. And this is obviously an important initiative for him. I think there was some reluctance on NATO's part to kind of expand its predominantly transatlantic focus. But I do think it's significant that they put all of these things in a statement. Like, these statements are much more than rhetoric. These multilateral organizations operate on consensus. And so if you're all saying as a consensus that China is a systemic threat, that obviously is concerning to China. But I do think in terms of, the Eastern European countries, the Baltics, they see Russia as a much bigger threat. And even you saw President Macron say, let's not over dramatize the threat posed by China at the expense of dealing with other more imminent challenges that Russia poses to the transatlantic security.
And yet, Bethany, you have this sense that there was this strategy to try to split the Europeans from the Americans, but kind of they overplayed their hand. China did, and sort of made it much easier in some ways for Washington to get this kind of consensus through a number of statements and wolf warrior-like diplomacy that we've seen coming out of China. Is that how you see it? Is that they just weren't subtle enough and frankly diplomatically engaged enough to get this right?
That's absolutely part of it. I mean, the Chinese officials did something really, really dumb. It was totally an own goal, and that was I think it was around March after the U.S. and UK and the EU issued some human rights sanctions on Chinese officials who they deemed complicit in human rights violations in Xinjiang and the authoritarian takeover of Hong Kong. And after those sanctions were issued, China did something unprecedented, which was to issue its own retaliatory sanctions on several European individuals and entities, including 5 members of the EU Parliament. Now, these sanctions are purely symbolic. They don't do anything really, but I think what happened in Europe was it was just like an enormous slap in the face, and kind of being shaken to reality to see that China is willing to take these kinds of actions. And almost immediately, that the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment that they had signed or agreed to sign in January, was put on ice. And if that hadn't happened, if China was still dangling out the CAI, and if Merkel could still view this as a big win, I think that these, the joint statements that we saw last week would have been much more difficult. And in January, when the EU and China did agree to sign that treaty, which had been in the works for a long time, and there had been this sort of not last minute, but a big push, as you mentioned, for China to get this signed. That was super smart. That was a very smart thing for Beijing to do, to drive an initial wedge, between the U.S. and the EU before the incoming Biden administration before Biden could even take office. So it was really shooting themselves in the foot. But I really agree with what Bobby and Elise have said on some other topics. And we mentioned how Merkel, the big and Macron kind of looked a little bit silly in this this most recent news coming out of the EU, that their desire to have a summit with Putin was pretty much destroyed by Baltic states and by Poland, who were warning about Russia. Interestingly, and it's certainly true that Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland, these Eastern European and Baltic states view Russia as a much bigger threat than China. The interesting thing is that in the past 2 to 3 years, these particular countries have started to sound the warning on China louder than almost any other country in the EU. The Czech Republic was really the first leader on calling out China, calling out Huawei, and facing some early consequences for that. The Estonian Foreign Intelligence Agency this year and last year issued really stark warnings on China, saying it was a threat to democracy. And the Estonians warned of a cowed world silenced by Beijing. Lithuania recently withdrew from a regional summit with China. And I spoke with their deputy foreign minister, who said that, we experienced we were able to enjoy democracy and enjoy rule of law and universal human rights because of Europe's strong support for democracy. We viewed China and their aggressive authoritarianism as an existential threat. So it's interesting to see that these smaller countries, in some ways, are actually being the loudest voices.
It's very interesting, Bethany. I think that's exactly right, and particularly those who really adhere to democratic principles because they know what it means not to have it, like the Baltic states. Bobby, jump in here. You wanted to come in.
I think Bethany is exactly right, and she raises the point that it now, because of these, earlier we were talking about China exploiting the divisions within Europe. Well, the Biden administration has an opportunity to do the same. I expect to see the State Department, Blinken and others, now work very hard with those small Eastern European countries, with the Czech Republic and others, to keep Europe honest on this, and to make sure that a Merkel or when she leaves the stage, Macron doesn't overreach and get too far ahead of the American agenda and try to keep the Europeans in line, more or less, behind the US. So there are opportunities for the Biden administration to work with, which would not have existed a year ago with the Trump administration. Just the fact that it is Biden, it is Blinken, and it's not Trump, that alone will count for quite a great deal, I think.
Yeah, that plus the way the Chinese kind of sort of played their hand, right? Yeah. But at least jump.
I also think that what the U.S. is going to try to do is kind of deepen the fissures between Russia and China. You've seen these, closer links, closer ties. There could be some exercises coming up. Putin has not ruled out some kind of security arrangement. So obviously Russia thinks that China could be a counterweight to the US in terms of what we were talking about, these authoritarians versus the democracies. But at the same time, I think that also comes from a place of insecurity with Russia, and it doesn't want to get close to China. So if Russia can have better relations with the US, then maybe they don't have to be so dependent on China. And I think the US, in terms of reaching out to China, obviously, there are a lot of other issues that Biden wanted to get on record with Putin, such as cybersecurity, such as human rights. I also think part of it is this larger architecture in terms of trying to countering China and bringing Russia back into that fold. And so I think that, how he deals with the Europeans on the Russia issue, on the China issue, you can't separate them. They're all interrelated.
I think that's exactly right, and it's a good transition, at least to the issue of sort of how did Russia experience the trip. Of course, Russia was a little different because they were a participant in the final meeting in Geneva, a very important meeting with Biden, between Biden and Putin. But if you are sitting in Moscow and you're looking at the G7, an organization you used to be a part of, right? And then the NATO summit, it may have mentioned China, but it mentioned Russia 62 times. And always as a threat, never as a partner. When you're looking at sitting in Moscow, how do you perceive what the Biden trip did for your situation, and how are you now going to try to address that reality?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag. Yes, the G7 was criticizing Russia. Yes, it was the NATO was looking at Russia as a threat, but they did see, China as this growing threat. And he also saw Putin over the last couple of days, this eruption or this, basically showdown and humiliation of, Merkel and Macron versus the Baltic states. Some of the more power, yes, some of the smaller European nations are criticizing Russia and don't want Germany and France and other countries that don't want NATO or the EU or the G7 to work more closely with Russia. But you see the most powerful nations, Germany, France, they want better relations with Putin. And I think he's going to accentuate the positive and look at that and say, that's a win for me. Yes, some of these smaller countries don't really pose a threat to me, but the big countries I want to deal with, Russia wants to deal with Germany, wants to deal with France, wants to deal with the UK, I think. And then when you look at the summit coming out of the meeting between President Biden and Vladimir Putin, he came out with a pretty upbeat assessment. Of course, he was denying that Russia had anything to do with the cyber hacks on the United States, was really kind of dismissive of the human rights accusations. But he's not going to really, Putin, come to any kind of summit and apologize or be contrite. But he did come out of the meeting and say, I do see areas of cooperation. I think he took Biden's rhetoric for what it was, rhetoric to a domestic audience to seem tough on Russia in a way that Donald Trump wasn't. But I think both leaders came out with an upbeat assessment. And aside from the rhetoric, I think there were important outcomes, such as the desire to bring both ambassadors. They agreed to return their ambassadors who had returned back home over these tensions. They decided to bring consultations on cyber-related issues. And so I think it's a mixed bag for Russia, but I think there are areas for it to exploit, particularly a new relationship with Biden. Maybe Trump was more friendly towards Russia, but I don't think they necessarily saw Donald Trump as a real interlocutor they could do business with. I think, as we've seen, Putin may not like Biden, he might not like what Biden says about him, but I think he respects him and is ready to do business.
Yeah, and I think that was pretty clear from his press conference in the way that he expressed himself. And there's this sense that at least they have somebody predictable to deal with, which is a good thing. Bobby, it seems to me some Europeans misread this Geneva meeting, though. They thought that all of a sudden we were in a reset in the relationship, and And here was Merkel and Macron, as both Bethany and Elise said, saying, you know what, if Biden can do it, we can do it. And they got slapped down pretty badly last night in what was Merkel's last summit meeting as at least as chancellor, unless it takes a long time to get another government going. How do you read this?
I think Merkel and Macron overreached and were reminded, and clearly they needed a reminder, that the EU works on consensus, and you have to bring all parties together. They have the luxury, the bigger European states, of not having borders with the Russians, not having to worry. They can't, sorry to use a cliche, but they can't feel the breath of the bear directly upon their necks, and whereas many of these smaller countries do, and these smaller countries are also struggle much more with Russian misinformation campaigns, as well as old-fashioned spycraft. And so I think it was important for them to see that there is not a consensus in the US, beg your pardon, in the EU, and they can't force one. I've often thought that the EU policy of having all or everybody or nobody, that kind of consensus, I've often found that frustrating, but this is one of those examples where I think it is reassuring that it exists.
Yeah, no, exactly. Sometimes consensus screws up getting anything done, but sometimes prevents bad things from happening. So that's exactly right. I mean, Bethany, Elise sort of hinted at, more than hinted at, sort of suggested that Putin might be looking at both balancing China and the United States, that they're trying to figure out where should they align and how is that relationship going. Of course, Xi Jinping and China will have a major vote and voice on that. How do Xi look at Putin? How does China look at Russia? Do they see this as the autocratic alignment that folks talk about, or are the tensions between those powers, which are longstanding, of course, from the Cold War era, likely to come back? How do you think China looks at this?
Well, I think the most important way to view a simplistic way, but a close to accurate way to view Russia in this situation is that Russia kind of has to flirt with both sides. There is not an alignment, but I would say, there's an authoritarian affinity between Russia and China, but there's a lot of tensions there too. And part of this is Russian hubris. They don't want to be number two to someone who used to be their little brother. And they also don't want to be, they just, in a geopolitical sense, don't want to be that far underneath a superpower. So they're in between two superpowers. Russia's a declining power. They have, their main source of power is as a disruptor through these maybe hybrid types of warfare, not necessarily traditional geopolitical heft, and certainly not economic heft. And I think it is, it would be an exaggeration to say that there is going to be a Russia-China bloc that the U.S. must, divide. And if the U.S. views it that way, and I don't think that they do, but if they did, that would be a strategic error, because that would cause the U.S. to give too much to Putin, to try to bring him closer to the West. The thing that the U.S. has to keep in mind here, and what Biden, I think, has been very explicit that he's keeping in mind, is that the larger issue here is rising authoritarianism, and you can't push back against authoritarianism that is increasingly confident as a model on a global scale when you're giving carrots to one of the most important authoritarian countries, which is Russia. China takes, I think, they're a little bit hard to read on this. They have been very quiet, when Russia does things that if the US did, or if some other country did, China would certainly be upset about it. The most obvious point would be the annexation of Crimea. I mean, that is, that technically crosses China's number one red line in foreign policy, which is interfering in the territorial sovereignty of another country. But they really said nothing. And Russia's cyber attacks, I mean, so many things. China's just been quiet. And they play spoiler, China does in a way, in so many of Western attempts to try to put pressure on Russia or Iran or many countries by serving as an economic buffer. Oh, you can still do trade with us. We'll send you oil, whatever. And certainly China has been playing that role. But they have some areas of disagreement with Russia. There's, I would say, a pretty hesitant détente in Central Asia, which Russia views as its own backyard. But China has really important and growing strategic and economic and political interests in Central Asia through its Belt and Road Initiative. The Central Asian countries have been really important political buffers for China, as they continue to pursue their policies of genocide in Xinjiang. So there's some areas here where there's a bit of tension.
Elise, the Biden administration, do they see this tension, and are they trying to exploit it? Was that part of the reason why Biden had this meeting with Putin, that we're going to have just as we had a Nixon to China moment, we have a Biden to Moscow moment in order to sort of bring Russia into the American fold, or is that geostrategic game too much to ask for? How do you think the folks in the U.S. are seeing this?
No, I mean, as I said earlier, I do think obviously Biden had a wider agenda with Putin, but I do think part of it is to kind of peel Russia away a little bit from China because of the reasons that Bethany said, that it does feel this insecurity when it comes to China. It doesn't want to become too interdependent on China economically, security-wise. I don't think that's really a concern, but ultimately, as China is growing and expanding its military, and there are areas where China does, as Bethany said, give a wide berth to Russia. But at the same time, Bethany made an important point about this authoritarianism, authoritarians versus democracies. And I think for the United States, it wants to be all or nothing. China is an authoritarian. Russia is an authoritarian. If you look at the two countries, maybe Putin wants to kind of take a hatchet to the international rules-based international system. China isn't necessarily like that. China has areas of the international system that work for it. It would like China to have more of a voice and not have the Western countries call all the shots. But China knows that its economies are really intertwined with the West, with the United States. And so I think there are more areas of cooperation with China, in my opinion, than there are with Russia. And I think when the US sets up this democracies versus authoritarianism, then what about issues like climate change, for instance, or pandemics, for instance, or proliferation, terrorism, all of these type of global issues, these transnational issues. And the U.S. is setting up this club versus democracies and versus authoritarians. They need to be in the club sometimes. And so I think this, putting two different cohorts is a little bit dangerous. I think it's important for the U.S. to emphasize its values. But when you set up an us versus them situation, then when you need those countries for more transnational and multilateral cooperation, I think the U.S. is going to have a hard time.
Yeah, and it becomes harder to break the two apart, right? If you want to play a geopolitical game of Russia versus China, if you also put them in the same category constantly, then this us versus them kind of perspective, the them are going to stick together, which is probably not what you're looking at.
Yeah, but they're also, they're not natural allies. We can club them together as they may be autocracies, Russia and China, but they're not natural allies. They were not natural allies when they were both communist states and both feared the United States. There are historic reasons, strategic reasons, economic reasons why Russia regards China with a certain amount of alarm. I mean, they don't want to be. If you go to the border areas between Russia and China, there's a lot of fear about what they think of as Sinicization, and the sort of Chinese population drifting across the border into Russian towns. There is a concern about the Belt and Road and how that sort of can constrain Russia. There are opportunities for Russia in it, but they're also worried that it allows China to expand tremendous influence in countries in Central Asia that Russia historically has regarded as its logical sphere of influence. When they see the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs very keen for Chinese investment and Chinese infrastructure building, in Moscow there are people who look at that and are concerned. So I think Elise is exactly right, that they shouldn't be thought of as sort of blocks in the traditional sense of it, for positive reasons, because we do need cooperation on international, some existential issues like the environment, but also strategically there are tactically there are some advantages in not thinking of them as a block, because then you can exploit the things that separate them.
I think important warnings from all three of you that if we make the mistake that so many American policymakers made in the 1960s of talking about the Sino-Soviet bloc as from a unified entity, you miss the opportunity strategically and otherwise that Nixon saw by breaking up that bloc from a strategic perspective. But then also the global problems don't lend themselves to being solved by bloc politics in the same way that they probably didn't even during the Cold War, but it becomes more difficult. So important warning to our policymakers from all three of you. Let me transition to another big story that did happen also this week, which is, of course, what happened in Iran. We had elections, Bobby, last Saturday, with the wholly expected result coming out of the leading conservative cleric winning the election. This was preordained, one would say, and I wasn't. That's not in a religious sense. Preordained. Track. How does this affect the calculation in Washington, in the region itself, which is changing rapidly as well, and of course in Tehran?
Well, so what it means for Iran is can be encapsulated in three data points emerging from the election. One, this is the lowest turnout in Iran's presidential election history, less than 50% for the first time. Two, the second place finisher was voided votes. And so a large proportion of people who went to vote either deliberately, probably deliberately, just basically voided their votes. And that's a very significant act of, it's the closest thing these days to an act of safe public disobedience. And the third thing, and this is depressing, but the moderate candidate got sort of fewer than, I think, something like 2 million votes, which is tiny amount. So the moderates, as if we didn't know this already, as a force in Iranian politics have now been completely shoved aside. And there has been a consolidation of the hardline forces in Iran. They now control all the levers of the Iranian state. Supreme leader, obviously, the one that matters most. They were already in control of the parliament, of the judiciary, of the armed forces, and now they have the presidency as well. There is a feeling in some quarters that this, to quote something you said earlier, that this allows for a Nixon to China opportunity, that Raisi, the new president, might be able to make a deal that a moderate president might not have been able to make because the hardliners would be constantly snipping at his ankles. I'm not optimistic about that. I think that to come to the second part of your question, what does this mean for the West and for the US? I think there is consensus in Iran that they want the sanctions lifted. They want the economy to have a chance of reviving. So Raisi has said that he wants the JCPOA to be back on track. But what it does is that, and for the Biden administration to pay attention, is that there'll be no other discussions beyond that. Biden administration had this, frankly, always slightly naive idea that if they got back into the JCPOA, that would allow for further discussions on all the other ways that Iran menaces its neighborhood and menaces the wider world. Raisi has no interest in doing that. Khamenei, the supreme leader, has no interest in doing that. And I don't think there's going to be a great deal of interest, even when the JCPOA is revived. There's not going to be a great deal of interest in American investment and American technology. Raisi very much is of the school that believes in Iranian, what they call the resistance economy, the self-sufficiency to the extent that they need outside support and help. He will be much more inclined to look to Russia, to China, and it wouldn't bother him at all if there were no American investors in Iran. So I think it's a sobering moment, a clarifying moment, even if it's not necessarily a sort of pivotal moment.
Thanks, Bobby. I think it's really a clear, wonderful overview of where we are. Bethany, how does China look at this? You know, the opportunity, it seems to me, is pretty large. They already moved forward after Trump withdrew from the JCPOA to try to fill that void. If Raisi is in fact saying we're not going, whatever happens in the JCPOA, we're not going back to the economic and promise and relationship that perhaps Rouhani was more interested in, yes or no, we don't know, and we'll never know. But clearly an opportunity here for China. How does the Chinese look at it, and what is your sense of Iranian willingness to continue that engagement?
Well, the China-Iran government relationship is very close and increasingly close. So one of Obama's big accomplishments was getting China to agree to cut off, to agree with, to go with sanctions, to go with multilateral sanctions. China hates sanctions. It rarely, it's rarely willing to go along, but it was, through that extensive diplomatic efforts at the beginning of the JCPOA. And the Trump administration coming in and blowing that up was all the excuse that China needed to, resume closer ties. And Iran and China, just sanctions aside, they have very close trade ties. If you go to Iran, you walk around in the bazaars, everything is made in China. Clothing and consumer electronics, and just so many things are made in China. Lots of business to business ties there. Security cooperation between Iran and China has gotten a lot closer. There's been reporting several years ago from the New York Times, Foreign Policy magazine showed how the big compromise of the CIA's covert communications network in China that resulted in the roll-up of the CIA assets in China actually started in Iran. So you have growing security cooperation there. However, the Iranian government isn't the only thing that exists, and you also have Iranian people. And it's hard to get a sense of what they want. It's an authoritarian country with extensive censorship. However, we do get rumblings. And I think there's a growing resentment and a growing fear of these ties, and a sense that China is perhaps becoming, if not a new kind of imperial power, at least it's another foreign government that has, too much power. It has its thumb on Iran, and there's I would say, growing resentment of that. And an interesting phenomenon here is that so how does China use its economic ties and its economic leverage over other countries in many different ways? But one thing it does is try to get those governments within their own countries to suppress information and sentiment that China doesn't want for its own, sort of narrow political and domestic reasons. And one big way that we've seen that lever of power being exercised is about Xinjiang. And there's been a ton of criticism of governments that sit over Muslim majority countries, and specifically governments that say they are themselves Islamic. A lot of them have been silent on the genocide that's happening against Muslims in China. And the reason for that almost all the time is this economic leverage or coercion that China has. But Muslims themselves in the Muslim majority countries don't necessarily have that same desire to stay silent. And in Iran, we've even seen some mullahs who have been censored. They have spoken out against the genocide in Xinjiang, and the Iranian government has censored them. So there's a complex relationship here on a people level, but the two governments are very convenient for one another.
Thanks. I think that's great. It's that we don't often hear about this relationship because the dominance of Iran in American thinking since 1979 doesn't include the reality that there's a world beyond the bilateral relationship. And Elise, on that bilateral relationship, you really have a sense that if the way that Bobby described the consolidation of the conservative power structure, we're at a dead end in some way with that relationship. Yes, we may get back into JCPOA, which maybe is a good thing for a few years in terms of denying a nuclear further nuclearization. But where does the Biden administration now think this relationship is going, and how would they like to use the reality that they now face with a pretty solid wall of conservative power structure in Iran to try to change the direction of that relationship?
Well, frankly, I mean, coming in, the Biden had said all along in the campaign he wanted to get back to the JCPOA. He never said anything about a better relationship with Iran or bringing Iran into the League of Nations, a little bit more like the Obama administration kind of hoped, and certainly John Kerry hoped, that a nuclear deal would lead to this rapprochement with Iran, better behavior by Iran in the region. You never heard any of that kind of rose-colored talk from President Biden. And even when he came in, they didn't jump immediately to having those talks. I think they were very measured about how they wanted to do it. And so I think if the Biden administration could get back to a status quo on the Iran deal, and the deal pretty much is done, it was negotiated through third parties with Iranians, but getting back to that kind of status quo, I think is possible. And certainly Khamenei, the supreme leader, wants to do that. There's some talk about whether the Biden administration can kind of ram this through before Raisi takes over, so that the moderate government of Rouhani gets all the blame if it doesn't work out and the sanctions aren't lifted, but the new president would get all the credit if the sanctions are lifted and things move forward. So I think that deal can be done. As Bobby said, I don't think it's possible really for some kind of larger follow-on deal. The Biden administration wanted to talk about longer sunset measures by which a longer period by which Iran can't develop nuclear technology or enrich to a certain degree. I don't think that's possible. Certainly missiles are not on the table or any kind of other behavior. But as Bethany was saying, that China, there's a wide world out there. There's also other countries that have a say. This may not be enough for Israel. And, you've seen some kind of attacks at facilities recently that, there's been suspicion that Israel is involved. There's also the Gulf states, some very interesting dynamics, not necessarily bearing much fruit, but between Saudi Arabia and Iran and the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who obviously wants to improve his own standing, is talking about having better relations with Iran. So I think we need to see the new president come in. I think we need to see how he plays his foreign policy. Obviously, Khamenei, his foreign policy is going to be very, he's the one that calls the shots, but how the economy improves, how this new president takes shape, I think will dictate how they deal with the rest of the world. And I don't necessarily think the Iran deal is necessarily kind of tethered to that entirely. I think it's you could pretty much say it's in a vacuum. Get the deal done and we'll deal with the rest of the dynamics later. The US has made clear that the Mideast is not their priority. Focusing on China, as we've been discussing pretty much this whole show, is clearly their priority. So they could say, it's the region's problem and we've got our nuclear deal and, we'll leave it at that.
I don't think that nuclear deal by itself will be worth very much, to be honest, because if you put yourself in the shoes of a major corporation or potential investor, if all you get is the same deal, then the same perils remain with the deal.
Ready to invest before, though. So
exactly.
Companies lined up to do it before.
Yeah, but at that point, they thought the companies lined up not just because the deal allowed them to do so, but there was a promise of an opening of Iran, not just economically, but a reintegration of Iran into the Western world or into the larger world. If you have just a deal, but if you have an Iranian government that is constantly belligerent and oppositional towards the West, as well as now what we've learned in the last 4 years, that the deal itself can easily be torn up by the act of a single capricious American leader, if I'm the head of Airbus, I will be worried about the potential of that particular history repeating itself. I would look around and think, wait a minute, when President Pompeo takes over in 3 years, or President Ivanka, God help us.
All right, that was my inner voice.
That's what realistically, what do I invest billions of dollars in Iran, knowing that this piece of paper can be shredded so easily, and knowing that you have an Iranian government that's not going to try to make nice with the Western world.
And
so
the same,
I think it's quite. Sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry. The same is true on the Iranian side.
Yeah.
You said, Bobby, you made the observation that the moderates just got destroyed, in this election. And part of the reason for that is that, the moderates put all their capital into this deal. And they said, look, it's going to make your lives better. And it didn't. They got totally, delegitimized by the total failure of that deal. And to expect that, that the Iranians would be willing. I mean, even if it weren't the hardliners in charge, and if it were the moderates, to say that they could try that again, who would believe that? Who would believe anyone's promises, whether it's the Iranian leaders or the U.S.?
But Khamenei has clearly put all of his eggs in Raisi's basket in terms of improving the economy. I mean, this guy is seen as a potential replacement as the supreme leader, and he's seen as the person that's going to turn the economy around. So yes, he's a hardliner. Yes, his foreign policy may be much tougher in terms of dealing with the U.S. and some of these other aspects, but he does need to deliver on the economy. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that particular responsibility plays out.
And it may be that China is the one that delivers for them economically, and then ask the question, how much did we gain, other than the fact, which I think the administration would point out, well, we did stop the nuclear weapons program for at least another few years if we get back into the JCPOA. But it just goes to show the world is a complicated place. You can't go back necessarily to the situations that existed 4 years ago. As it churns. And I want to thank all three of you, Bobby Ghosh, Elise Labott, and Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian.